Hello, my friend. Today I will tell you another long-forgotten legend. Close your eyes and let the magic transport you to Middle-earth. Our journey begins in the hush of an age long faded into the folds of time, when the world was wider and the stars sang of secrets not yet forgotten. There lay a kingdom carved between the spine of mountains and the breathless hush of the sea. It was not marked on many maps, nor was it often spoken of in the high halls of elves or among the towers of men. Yet those who remembered gave it many names: Endor, the star-bound realm, or simply the Silent Watch. So called because its people kept to themselves, and its king, it was said, spoke more often to the wind than to his court. He was a man of high lineage, tall and grave, with eyes like flint beneath a sky of storm. His name has been forgotten in the tide of ages, erased by shadow and war. But those who once served him called him Valandor, the Quiet Flame. For though he bore the blood of Númenórean in his veins, his voice was seldom raised, and his wrath, when stirred, burned not in fire, but in silence colder than death. His people loved him for his wisdom, feared him for his stillness, and wondered always at the dreams that troubled his sleep. Each night the king would climb the western tower of his citadel, the Tower of Twilight, where the stones were veined with star metal, and the air tasted of frost and memory. There he would stand alone, wrapped in sable and silver, and speak softly to the wind, though no one ever heard the words. His steward, a gentleman named Thalion, once dared to ask what he saw there, night after night, beyond the edge of the world. The king had not answered, but his eyes, deep and dark, had filled with the light not of this world, and then he turned away. It was during such a vigil that the stranger came. The gatekeeper spoke of a figure clad in robes of gray and gold, a voice like the whisper of leaves on stone, and eyes that gleamed red, red like the last light before the sun drowns beneath the sea. He carried no weapon, bore no name, but in his presence the air grew heavy, and the guards stepped back as if compelled by a will they could not comprehend. He asked to speak with the king alone. That night no fires were lit in the citadel, no horns called out the hour. The guards stood dumb like statues, their eyes wide with something between awe and fear. And within the Tower of Twilight, beneath its starlit vault, King Valandor received a visitor who would change the fate of the world. No one knows what was spoken between them, only that when morning came, the stranger was gone, and in the king's hand was a ring. It was wrought of gold so pale it seemed forged from moonlight. Set into its crown was a gem blacker than obsidian, but within it swirled the faintest hint of fire, like a coal buried beneath glass. The king did not speak of it, but from that day forward he no longer stood alone on the tower. He stood with a ring upon his finger, and the wind that once answered his voice now grew still, as though listening. Soon after, the dreams began. He dreamed of a great throne beneath the earth, built of bones and silent cries. He dreamed of voices, some pleading, others mocking, voices that called him by names not his own. Sometimes he would wake speaking in tongues lost since the fall of Bion. Other times he would not wake at all, but wander the halls of his citadel in silence, his eyes unseeing, his hands trembling, as if weighed by unseen burden. His court grew anxious. The steward Thalion wrote to the lore masters of the West and the seers of the East. "Something stirs in the mind of our king," he wrote. something old and dark and cunning. But the messages never returned. The messengers never came back. Then came the winter without end. Snow fell for 7 moons. The sea froze and the rivers forgot their songs. The stars dimmed and the sun rose blood red as if mourning. Crops withered before they touched the earth, and animals howled at shadows no eye could see. Within the citadel, the king's presence grew fainter, as though he were slipping through the cracks of the world. He no longer held court, he no longer spoke, he no longer ate. But still he wore the ring. Then, on the darkest night of that endless winter, a child was born in the village at the foot of the mountain. The midwife, an old woman blind in one eye and wise in the other, said the babe had a birthmark shaped like a crown of thorns, and a voice that cried, not like a babe, but like a broken bell. The villagers, filled with dread, brought the child before the king, hoping for guidance. Valand looked upon the child, and, for the first time in moons, he smiled. It was not a kind smile. From that night onward, the king changed. He began to speak not in the tongue of men, but in some deeper language that made stones tremble and stars flicker. He ordered the construction of a great temple beneath the citadel, where no one but he could enter, and each night he would descend into it, carrying with him the child who never seemed to grow. The people grew afraid. Whispers stirred in the snowbound silence. They said the king no longer slept, that he had bargained with something beyond the veil of the world, that the ring upon his hand was not a gift, but a curse. And they were right. In the 3rd year of endless winter, the mountain cracked, not with earthquake nor fire, but with song. A song of sorrow and ruin, sung not with voice, but with silence. It echoed through the bones of the earth, and all who heard it forgot their names for a moment and the shape of their thoughts. From the cliff in the mountain poured a mist darker than night, colder than death, and in its midst walked the king. But he was no longer Valandor. He bore no crown, no face, no name. His eyes burned with emptiness, and his shadow fell long and far. The child was gone. The ring gleamed like a star fallen into ash, and those who looked upon him wept, not knowing why. He spoke no words, only raised a hand, and the snow stopped falling. The sea unbound. The stars flickered back to life, and in the hearts of men a new fear was born. A king had returned, but he had come not to rule, but to conquer. The day after the mountains sang its sorrow, and the king emerged draped in shadow, the sky wore a strange hue, not the gray of winter, nor the azure promise of spring, but something pale and bruised, like the skin of a wound left untended. The wind that had once wandered through the mountain passes now stood still, hesitant, uncertain, as though it too feared what had awakened. The trees did not sway, the birds did not cry, and even the sea far below held its breath. It was as if the very world around the silent watch had entered a mourning it could not yet name. Thalion, the steward, had watched the transformation with a heart slowly unraveling thread by thread. Where once he had served a man quiet and noble, now he found himself serving a presence. And though that presence still wore the king's face, or something like it, it was as if Valandor had become a mirror turned inward, reflecting only the long corridors of his own haunted soul. Tan walked the marble halls of the citadel, where once voices laughed and banners stirred, and now only echoes dared speak. He found the king in the garden that clung to the side of the western wall, where frost had long claimed every leaf, and the fountain no longer flowed but stood frozen in a moment of silver despair. The king stood beside it, his robes trailing behind him like tattered mist, and the ring upon his hand shimmered faintly, with a glow that flickered as if it were feeding off the cold light of the distant stars. There was no warmth in him now, only purpose, and that purpose was wrapped in silence. "My lord," Thalion said, his voice careful, low, reverent yet uncertain, as one might speak to a thundercloud that had taken the shape of a man. "The people, they speak in whispers. They fear what they cannot name, and what they have seen with their own eyes refuses to take root in their hearts." The king did not move for a long while. He simply stood there watching the ice that encased the fountain. When he spoke, it was not with the voice Thalion had known for so many years, but with something slower, heavier, as if each word was being drawn up from a deep well of memory and regret. "Do they not understand?" he said, not turning. "The fear they carry like stones in their chests is but a flicker of what lies beyond the veil. I have seen it, Phalon. I have walked to the edge of time, where names lose their meaning and light is swallowed by itself. And what I have seen, I cannot unsee." Balian stepped closer, his breath visible in the frozen air, and though his bones trembled beneath the weight of those words, he pressed on. "Then speak to me of it, my king. Let me share the burden, if only a corner of it. Tell me what brought this change, and why your silence now feels like the prelude to something far darker." At last the king turned. His face was pale, too pale, as if he had been carved from the same ice that sheathed the garden. But his eyes, oh, those eyes, they no longer reflected the world. They drank it in, and in their depths was not madness nor cruelty, but something far more terrible. "Do you remember the stories of the star Kindler?" he asked suddenly, his voice like the hush before snowfall. "A VAR who placed the stars in the sky to sing against the dark?" Dahlia nodded, uncertain. "Yes, the elves sing her name when they look toward hope." The king gave a slow, almost imperceptible smile. "Hope," he whispered. "Such a fragile flame. I once believed in hope, Thalion. I believed in its shape and weight, in its promise. But I have learned that even hope can be hollow, that stars are not guardians, but watchers, and when they gaze down upon us, they do not weep for our sorrows, they merely endure them." He paused then, stepping to the fountain's edge and resting his hand upon the ice. Beneath his touch, the frost hissed faintly, curling like smoke, though it did not melt. "This ring," he said, raising his hand, fingers SP the stone, now pulsing with a strange inner light, "was not forged by a friend. It was not gifted. It was left as one might leave a door ajar in a storm, or a mirror cracked at the edge. It calls not to my will, but to my want." Tan's brow furrowed, and he moved forward with a boldness born not of defiance, but of desperation. "And what is it that you want, my king? What does your heart cry out for, that you would walk among shadows and call them brothers?" The king turned back to the frozen garden, to the dead trees and frost-changed roses. His voice was softer now, not with gentleness, but with that aching stillness that comes when a soul folds in upon itself. "I want to be remembered," he said, "not as a name etched in stone or a song sung by fading tongues, but as something deeper, enduring, immutable. I want to carve myself into the bones of the world, so that even the stars in their cold eternity must reckon with my shadow." Thalion was silent then, and in that silence the wind stirred for the first time in many days. It curled around them, whispering through the branches of the lifeless trees as if testing the edges of this newfound will. "But such remembrance," Thalion said at last, "comes at a price, my lord, and I fear that in seeking to E.T. yourself into time, you have allowed yourself to be unmade." The king looked at him then, truly looked, and something old flickered across his face. A remnant, a ghost, a memory of the man he had once been. "We are all being unmade," he murmured. "Every breath, every dream, every moment we dare to believe the world is as it should be. I have simply chosen to turn toward the unraveling and walk willingly into it." And with that, he turned and walked away, his cloak trailing frost where it brushed the stones, and the ring upon his finger humming with the quiet, patient hunger of something ancient, something watching, something waiting. Above them the clouds broke for a moment, and a single star shone through, pale and flickering, but it did not bring comfort. It merely observed. It was in the third season of that lingering winter, when even time itself seemed to grow weary of the cold, and the sun's passage across the sky slowed to a reluctant crawl, that Thalion sought again the counsel of his king. Not from duty alone did he descend the winding stair into the subterranean heart of the citadel, but from the burden of a grief that had grown heavier with each passing dusk. The people, though silent, had begun to fade, not in body, but in spirit. Their laughter had withered like leaves that never turned to gold, only fell brittle and gray. The children no longer ran beneath the arches of the marble courtyards. The smith's forge no longer rang with song. Even the light of the lanterns felt somehow paler, more distant, as if the flame itself feared being seen. The halls below were colder than the wind-swept heights above. They had been carved not with warmth and memory, but with precision and silence. Stone upon stone laid not for beauty, but for the concealment of things unspoken. The walls did not echo with footfall, but absorbed sound into themselves, as if the very stone wished to forget what it heard. Thalion moved through these halls slowly, his fingertips trailing the runes etched faintly along the edges, marks from a time before the citadel, before even the naming of the mountain. The deeper he walked, the more the air changed, not just in temperature but in texture. It felt dense, thick with unseen voices, as if the space between walls held the residue of thoughts too dark to rise. He found the king alone in the chamber where none but he dared go. The walls here were smooth, as if shaped by wind and water, not chisel. A great circular room without torch or window, and yet lit by a strange diffuse glow that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. In the center stood a basin of obsidian, and within it not water, but shadow, shifting, writhing softly like the breath of dreams left unfinished. The king stood beside it, one hand hovering just above the surface, as though drawing something unseen from its depths. His posture was not that of a monarch in meditation, but of a man suspended on the edge of something vast, a precip between revelation and ruin. "My lord," Thalion began, his voice little more than a breath, for anything louder felt like it would crack the delicate silence of the chamber. The king did not look up, but he responded, and his voice was softer now, more intimate, as though the walls were listening, and he wished to tell only then what he could no longer say to the world. "I dreamed again last night, not of what was, but of what might yet be. The world, then, do you know what it looks like without time? Without the slow, comforting decay we call memory?" Thalion stepped closer, though each step felt like he was walking into a tide he could not see. "No, my lord, but I fear I shall, should your silence continue." At this, the king's lips curved into a faint smile, not of mirth, but of recognition. "You are brave," he said. "Braver than most, perhaps braver than I. For you still cling to the notion that words can mend what is already turned to ash." "I do not seek to mend," Fan said, his voice rising, trembling not with fear, but with grief that had long been silenced. "I seek to understand, and if not that, then at least to remember rightly. You were not always this. There was a time when the children sang in the gardens, when you walked among your people not as shadow, but as soulless." "What broke that man?" The king's hand fell slowly to his side, and for a long moment he was silent. Then he turned, not quickly, not suddenly, but with a weariness that seemed carved into the very seamess of his body. His eyes found Thalion, and they were no longer bright, no longer burning. They were hollow, vast, like windows opening onto a night sky where no stars had ever been born. "What broke him?" he said, almost gently. "Hope did. The idea that there is a purpose behind all things, that there is order, harmony, justice. I clung to it, Thalion, even when the signs turned sour, even when the dreams grew dark and the stars fell silent. But the ring, this ring, it did not deceive me with visions of dominion or glory. No, it whispered something far more terrible. It told me the truth." Doan stepped forward, unable to restrain the rising tide within his chest. "What truth? That all is meaningless? That there is no goodness in the fabric of things? That the light we seek is but illusion?" The king raised the hand that bore the ring, and for a moment the chamber seemed to constrict as though the very stone recoiled from that gesture. The gem flowed now with a deep inward burning fire, like an ember left in the heart of a dead world. "No," the king said slowly. "It told me that the light itself is cruel, that it shines not to guide but to judge, that those who bask in it are not favored but exposed, and those who hide are not evil but forgotten. And so I chose not to seek the light, but to become the shadow in which others might hide." The silence that followed was unbearable. Thalion felt the weight of those words settle upon him like ash after fire, heavy and choking. And yet somewhere in his heart a small flame refused to yield. "Then let me hide there with you," he said, voice breaking. "If this is the end of all things, if the stars are lies and the world is blind, then let me stand with you in the dark. But do not walk alone. Do not let yourself become the very emptiness you seek to fill." The king looked at him, and for the briefest flicker of a heartbeat, His face softened. A breath, a tremor, the memory of a name. "I do not walk alone," he said. "Not yet, but the path grows narrower with each step." And then he turned again to the basin, his fingers hovering once more above its surface, and the shadow within it shifted, as if recognizing the return of its master. The chamber pulsed faintly, like the heartbeat of some ancient thing waking in the deep. Dalan said no more. He stood still and silent and watched his king slip further into whatever mystery now held him fast. And all around them, the stone whispered not words, not song, but a breath that had been held too long, now exhaled into the dark. Above, in the world that still believed in dawn, snow began to fall again. Not in flurries, but in a soft, continuous hush, as though the sky itself was beginning to forget how to speak. The days that followed unfolded not in any ordinary cadence of time, but in a kind of slow, disjointed drift, as though the very fabric of the world was beginning to unravel at its edges, thread by unseen thread. The sun, when it appeared at all, hovered low upon the horizon like a wounded eye, neither warming nor guiding, but merely watching, distant, withdrawn, and unconcerned. The snow did not cease, nor did it change. It fell without passion, like the exhalation of a world too weary to weep, and blanketed the kingdom in a soft, soundless paw that seemed less like a season's passing and more like the hush of burial. The citadel, once gleaming white with marble and gold-veined stone, now stood muted beneath the frost, its towers reduced to silhouettes against a sky smeared in ash and lightless cloud. Vines, once lovingly tended, curled inward and died without ceremony. The air was filled not with birdsong or laughter or even the sound of footsteps, but with the slow, cold creaking of wood strained under ice and the distant, aching groan of the wind as it curled through the narrow passes like an old soul forgotten in its wandering. Thalion wandered these halls in silence, the folds of his cloak brushing against frost-bitten stone, and his thoughts ever more entangled, curled and recoiled like roots lost in winter. He no longer sought council chambers or high towers. Instead, he walked the long corridors of memory, past stained-glass windows that depicted myths of light and valor, now dulled by frost and half-shattered by time. He paused often in these places, gazing through the fractured glass at the scenes beyond, as though hoping the past might yet offer a glimmer of guidance to the present. But the light that once streamed through those windows now lay broken upon the floor in colors too faded to name. It was during one of these wanderings that he came upon the Queen's garden. None had walked here since her passing, not even the servants who once tended to it with reverence and love. It was a place sacred to memory, overgrown now, half consumed by the creeping fingers of winter, yet still echoing faintly with the sweetness of another time. The garden had once been a marvel, terraces of soft moss, flowering trees that bloomed in tandem with the stars, and a pool in the center so still it had been said to mirror not only the sky, but the thoughts of those who gazed upon it. Now it was all in ruin. The moss had turned brittle and brown, the blossoms lay buried under ice, the pool was frozen over, and the mirror it once had been was now only a cold, indifferent stone. Ellen stepped into this forgotten sanctuary and let the silence embrace him. He knelt by the edge of the pool, resting a gloved hand upon the frozen surface, and closed his eyes. His thoughts were not orderly things. They swirled in him like snow caught in a whirlwind, grief and longing and doubt mixing into a single aching silence. He did not hear the king approach, not until the sound of frost crunching beneath deliberate steps broke the stillness. "Of all the places to seek counsel," the king said softly, "you choose the one I avoid." Elend did not rise, but he opened his eyes and gazed across the frozen pool. "Perhaps that is why I chose it, because I longed to speak to the man you were, not the shadow you have become." A long pause followed, not of anger or surprise, but of something deeper, like a chasm within the soul, widening to reveal what had been buried beneath it. The king stepped forward, his cloak dragging a trail in the snow, like the wake of a ship through still waters. He stood at the opposite edge of the pool, gazing into its heart as though expecting it to speak. "I used to come here," he murmured, "when the burdens of the throne pressed too heavily upon my shoulders. She would be here always. She never spoke of politics or omen, only flowers, birds, the color of the stars. She once said that the sky is a wound that is never healed, and the stars are the stitches trying to hold it together." He laughed then, softly, bitterly, as though the memory were both a balm and a blade. "I thought her fanciful then, but now I see perhaps she saw what I refused to." Thalion stood slowly, his breath a pale wraith upon the air. "And what is it that you see now, my king, in this garden of ghosts?" The king did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed upon the ice. "That beauty is not salvation. It is mourning made delicate. And love is not the cure for despair. It is the most exquisite form of it." "Of you," he said, his voice unsteady but firm, "that still clings to the memory of what was good. I see it in your words even now. You speak of sorrow because you remember joy. You speak of darkness because you once loved the light." The king turned then slowly, and for the first time in many days truly looked at Thalion, not as a servant or a steward, but as a man who had walked beside him through seasons of war and peace, joy and loss. "There is a thread," the king said, "thin as gossamer, binding us to what we once were. But the wind pulls at it, the frost stiffens it, and there will come a time, my friend, when it will snap." Thalion stepped forward, crossing the icy pool with careful, deliberate steps, until he stood but an arm's length from the man who had once held the hearts of his people like a sacred fire. "Then let it not snap today," he said. "Let us remember what still binds us, even if it is only the silence of this garden and the woman who once walked its paths." The wind stirred then, not fierce but soft, curling around the broken statues and withered hedges, lifting a few snowflakes from the branches as if the garden itself were exhaling a long-held breath. For a time they stood there, king and steward, on the edge of memory and forgetting. And though the snow still fell and the stars remained hidden behind veils of cloud, there was in that moment a hush that was not dread, but something gentler, a recognition, a pause in the unraveling. And beneath the ice, though unseen, a single crack began to form, not of destruction, but of thaw. The following morning broke with a dull and reluctant light, not so much rising as merely bleeding into the sky, as though the heavens themselves had grown weary of their duty. The snow continued to fall in its quiet procession, But now, beneath its soft and endless descent, something had shifted. Imperceptible, perhaps, to the ordinary soul, but to those whose hearts still beat with the aching rhythm of old oaths and older grief, the air carried a new weight, like the hush before a breath is drawn, or the silence after the first crack of spring's thaw in a long dead forest. Balian rose before the bells that no longer rang, dressing in his steward's mantle with motions that had become automatic, yet not without ceremony. There was a reverence in the way he fastened each clasp, and how he drew the dark blue fabric around his shoulders, not for vanity or custom, but for remembrance, for dignity, for the fragile scaffolding of identity that he refused to let slip, even as the world seemed to forget itself. He paused before the frost-rimmed mirror, not to gaze at his reflection, but to feel its absence, to acknowledge the man who had once looked into such a mirror with certainty, with purpose, and now searched only for continuity. Outside the high arched windows of his chamber, the garden of stone and ice lay in silence. The trees stood like statues sculpted in sleep, their limbs held oft in a stillness that was neither death nor dorsey, but something more enigmatic, a kind of listening. The snow upon the rooftops and towers glowed faintly under the iron sky, casting an ambient pallor that seemed to come not from above, but from the earth itself, as though Middle-earth, in some secret grief, had begun to reflect its own sorrow back into the heavens. Diane descended once more into the deeper halls of the citadel, his steps echoing through corridors that had once bustled with counsel and laughter, and now responded only with the echo of emptiness. He passed beneath great tapestries woven with scenes of ancient valor, kings crowned beneath flowering trees, ships with sails like stars upon the sundering seas, dragons falling to swords of light, and women who sang "To the Moon" and held sorrow in their palms like sacred fruit. The colors of these images had faded, not merely with age, but with disuse, with forgetting, as though memory itself grew weary when not spoken aloud. He found the king in the high library, a chamber vast and vade, where the ceiling rose into shadow and the shelves climbed like stairways toward unseen summits. The air here was heavy with the scent of parchment leather and time, a comforting weight like the embrace of an old friend who bore your burdens without question. A fire smoldered low in the hearth, its embers glowing softly, not with warmth, but with endurance. The king stood near the window, one hand resting lightly on the sill, his gaze turned outward toward the distant mountains whose peaks were now veiled in snow like monks in silent prayer. Leon did not speak immediately. He watched the king in silence, studying the subtle shift of his shoulders, the quiet tension in his hands, the stillness in his posture that spoke not of peace, but of a struggle so inward it left no mark on the flesh. And when he did speak, it was with a voice low and reverent, as one might address a wounded god. "You sought these halls once for wisdom," he said softly, "for the voices of the dead whose thoughts still live in ink and vellum. Do they speak to you now?" The king turned slowly, and in his eyes was not the blaze of power nor the void of despair, but something quieter, sadder, resignation perhaps, or something deeper still, the aching weight of having understood too much. "They murmur," he said, his voice like wind slipping through a ruined gate. "Not with answers, but with questions I can no longer ask. These books, these scrolls, they speak of empires and destinies, of the fate of kings and the will of Eru. but none of them tell me what to do when the road leads only into fog. None of them say how one should walk when the path is no longer made of stone, but of shadow and sorrow." Thalion stepped forward, his boots whispering against the flagstones. "Perhaps they do not say because the choice cannot be written, because it is not a tale to be read, but a burden to be borne." The king's expression did not change, but his gaze grew distant, as though seeing something far beyond the walls of that room. "Do you know, Thalion, what it is to look into the abyss and feel it stir in recognition? To feel its cold hand reach for yours, not to pull you in, but to offer you its silence, its simplicity. There is a temptation in it, not evil, not corruption, but clarity. The world becomes quiet, linear. There are no thrones in the dark, no voices calling for justice or mercy. There is only stillness." Thalion's heart ached at those words, not from fear, but from the deep and terrible understanding that they were not born of madness, but of weariness, of a soul that had carried too much for too long and had found in shadow a kind of sanctuary. "But there are no stars there," he said gently, "and no memory, only forgetting. And to be forgotten, my lord, is that not the truest death?" The king looked at him then sharply, and in that gaze was a flicker, just a flicker, of the man who had once spoken with poets, who had held his queen's hand beneath the flowering trees, who had lifted children onto his shoulders and laughed without fear. "No," he said after a long silence, "to be remembered falsely is the truest death. To become a legend sculpted by the hands of others, to be cast in gold while the truth withers in the dust, that I will not allow." He turned from the window and moved to the shelves, his hand drifting over the spines of ancient tones as though seeking a single thread among 1,000, a whisper of clarity and a sea of noise. "There are writings here, Thalion," he murmured, "old and obscure scraps of thought from the East, from the forgotten tongues. They speak of rings not made by elven smiths, of P struck not with Morgoth, but with the silence that followed him. They call it the under-voice, the will that waits." Alon's blood chilled at those words, not because they were spoken with malice, but because they were spoken with reverence. "Then cast it away," he whispered. "Cast the ring into the fire, into the sea. Let the silence end." The king turned again slowly, and though his face bore the marks of countless sleepless nights, his voice held a strange, final calm. "I cannot," he said, "for it no longer waits. It listens." And somewhere in the library, beyond the shelves, beyond the pages, a whisper stirred. A whisper not of words, but of knowing. And the fire in the hearth dimmed, though no wind had passed. Night fell like the closing of an ancient book, whose pages had grown so brittle with time that even the stars dared not turn them. It came not swiftly, nor with the clarity of a descending curtain, but slowly, like the steady dimming of a lantern lost in a sea mist, its edges curling inward, consuming the last hues of twilight with reluctant melancholy. The sky, once dusted with soft ash-gray clouds, deepened into a colorless void where no moon rose and no constellation dared speak. And yet, it was not darkness that fell over the citadel. It was something else entirely, something more oppressive and more intimate. It was silence that thickened, silence that listened, and silence that remembered. The high windows of the king's library shuttered in their lates, though no wind stirred the world beyond. Somewhere far below the eaves and echelons of the tower, the snow whispered against stone, soft as breath, cold as forgotten prayers. Thalion had not moved since the whisper passed. He stood still, his spine tight with the tension of things unspoken, and though the room was cold, a sheen of sweat glistened faintly at his temple. His fingers, which moments before had curled with quiet dignity around the folds of his robe, now dug subtly into the fabric, as though grasping for grounding, an anchor against the vast and wordless pull that now seemed to emanate not from the ring alone, but from something deeper, something beneath language, beneath form. The king paced with the deliberation of one who walks a path he has walked many times in dream, but never with waking feet. His steps echoed but softly, as though muffled by the weight of what he carried not in his hands, but in his spirit. The walls seemed to bend subtly around him, not with physical distortion, but with a kind of reverence or fear, or both. And the books lining the chamber, countless in number, so ancient that some had bindings of bark and ink wrought in silver dust, did not seem to watch him. They seemed to turn inward, as if unwilling to bear witness to what he had become. "You fear it," the king said suddenly, without turning, his voice a low murmur that vibrated with layered timbres. His own voice, and beneath it, something else, like the resonance of a deep chime buried in the earth. The presence that stirs the quiet that follows. You fear the silence because you still believe it is empty. Thalion exhaled slowly, his voice emerging like a sigh carried up from the bottom of a well. "I do not fear the silence itself, my lord. I fear what it reveals in us when it strips away all pretense, all illusion. When there is nothing left to distract us, not the song of the world, nor the cry of duty. Only the raw, unfiltered shape of our souls reflected back in the dark." The king paused, one hand resting gently upon the spine of a tomb whose title had long since faded from its leather binding. He did not answer immediately. His fingers moved slowly as though reading the shape of the letters by memory, or perhaps by instinct. "Then you fear truth," he said at last, not unkindly, "as do all who are bound to the light. For light reveals, yes, but it also distorts. It casts shadow. It demands simplicity. In the light, all things must be known, named, tamed. But the dark—" He lifted his gaze, not to Thalion, but to the unlit hearth across the room. "The dark allows for mystery. It allows for what cannot be named." Thalion stepped forward, the hem of his robe brushing lightly against the marble floor, his eyes never leaving the figure before him. "But mystery is not always mercy, and not all silence is sacred. There is a silence born of awe, yes, a hush that falls when the stars align, or a child takes their first breath. But there is also silence born of grief, of abandonment, of despair so deep that even thought drowns in it." The king turned then fully, his eyes shadowed by the flickering light of the last embers, and yet bright in a way that no earthly fire could account for. "Despair," he said, tasting the word like one might taste a bitter herb known to heal or to harm. "Yes, that is the doorway. Not joy, not courage, not faith. Despair opens the mind. It peels back the skin of the world and shows us what lies beneath. He moved closer to the hearth and knelt, feeding the remaining coals with a single breath, and they flared briefly, fiercely, before settling again into their slow, pulsing glow. The light danced across the carved wood of the mantel, illuminating figures of old, the Vala, or riding beneath the moon, the trees of Valandor carved in flight. All these images flickered as though uncertain, as though caught between memory and myth. "Do you know," the king continued, his voice now quieter, almost tender, "why the ring does not burn me? Why it does not corrupt me in the way we were taught to fear?" He lifted his hand slowly, the gem glowing softly, pulsing like a heart beneath still skin. "Because I do not resist it. I do not fight it. I listen. I allow. And in return, it does not consume me." Thalion felt a chill rise through his body, not from the cold, but from the recognition that the king no longer saw the ring as burden or curse or even power. He saw it as mirror, and perhaps that was the truest danger. Not that it changed him, but that it showed him what he already was and made him embrace it. "I hear them too," Thalion said quietly, almost to himself. "Not the whispers, but the memories of laughter echoing through these halls, of spring breezes carrying the scent of elderflower, of song sung in the high towers. And I wonder, if you were to silence every voice, every page, every memory, what would be left of us?" The king's gaze met his, and for a heartbeat the room grew utterly still. Even the coals ceased their whispering. "Perhaps," the king said, "what would be left is what we were meant to be. Not the fragments that history demanded, not the masks we wore for love or for law, but the raw shape of our own design, the shadow before the flame." And then slowly, deliberately, he turned back to the hearth and cast a single page into the fire. It flared, folded inward and vanished, its words lost, its story unspoken. Outside the snow thickened. The stars remained hidden, but in the deep places of the citadel, beneath the oldest star stones, something stirred again. Not loudly, not yet, but with purpose. It was listening. The air in the library after the burning of the page thickened with a stillness that was not emptiness, but presence, dense, pervasive, and laden with something unspoken. The scent of charred vellum lingered faintly in the room, its curled smoke twisting upward like a departing soul, brushing against the carved rafters and vanishing into the quiet arches above. It was not acrid, nor did it bite the throat. It was soft, even sweet in its own way, like the last breath of something ancient relinquishing its form. The fire to no longer danced. It crouched low in the hearth, coals smoldering as if dreaming, casting long, slow-moving shadows across the floor that seemed less like distortions of shape and more like recollections of another time, echoes of movement that had long since passed beyond the reach of memory. The shelves, once silent and dignified, now loomed with subtle weight. The books upon them seemed to lean inward as if listening, or perhaps recoiling, an unreadable tension etched into their bindings, into the curvature of their spines, into the dust that had begun to gather like frost in the corners. Even the stone beneath Fawn's boots felt less solid, less certain, as though the ground itself had entered into hesitation, unsure whether to hold or to yield. The world, it seemed, was watching. Elend remained where he stood, unmoving, his breath barely rising. Not because he was afraid, but because motion felt somehow profane, like a ripple across a sacred pool. His heart beat slowly now, methodically, each thrum a reminder of the fragile continuity he still clung to, a fragile thread of identity stretching taut across a chasm of doubt. He watched the king closely, not as one studies a sovereign, nor even a friend, but as one watches a fire at the edge of a dry forest, mesmerized, reverent, and deeply uncertain whether it would warm or consume. "My lord," he said at last, voice hushed, not out of deference, but necessity, as though louder words might shatter the delicate equilibrium of the moment. "What would you have me do?" The king did not answer immediately. He stood with his back to the An, gazing into the dying fire, with an expression caught between contemplation and mourning. His hands, once steady and decisive in council and battle, now hung loosely at his sides, as though the very weight of his own limbs was a burden he had long since grown weary of carrying. When he did speak, his voice emerged not as declaration, but as a slow unfolding, a thought revealed not with urgency, but with gravity. "I do not seek obedience," he said, "nor agreement. I do not summon you here to command or to coerce. I speak to you because you are the last voice I still recognize as mine. Because in this place, where even memory begins to falter, your presence is the last echo of what I once believed I was." Thalion lowered his gaze then, not in submission, but in sorrow. There was a strange pain in hearing such vulnerability from the man who had once stood like a pillar between his people and despair, a pain sharpened by the knowledge that it came not from weakness, but from an unbearable weight of clarity. "I see you," he whispered, barely audible, "but I do not know what you have become. I do not know whether the man I served still walks within you, or if he has vanished into the shadow entirely." The king turned then, slowly, his face revealed in the low fur light. It was not cruel, nor monstrous, nor even broken. It was simply weary, sketched with the quiet erosion of years, unspoken of truths carried too long without rest. His eyes, though strange and distant, held no threat. They held only reflection. "Perhaps both," he said. "Perhaps I am the memory of that man wandering the halls of my own ruin, looking for a door that no longer exists. Or perhaps I have become something new, something truer, even if darker. For who are we, Thalion, if not the sum of the choices we make in silence? In those moments when no one watches, when the world offers no applause, when only the stone and the sky bear witness." Deland drew in a breath slow and deliberate, as if drawing strength not from his body, but from the very walls around him. His gaze swept across the chamber, over the carved columns, the fading tapestries, the silent books, and he felt again that strange stirring in the stones, that sense of something waiting, poised just beyond the veil of knowing. "We are the echo of what we love," he said quietly, "and what we fear. We are not forged only in silence, but in remembrance, in the choices that break us, yes, but also in those that mend us. If you believe yourself no longer whole, then let this be the place you return to, not to end, but to remember how to begin." The king closed his eyes for a long moment, and the silence that followed was vast. Not empty, but full of tension, like the final breath before a leap or a fall. When he opened them again, the fire had nearly died. Only a single coal remained, its glow faint and flickering like a heartbeat on the edge of surrender. And then, softly, as though speaking to the fire itself, the king murmured, "There is a name I have not spoken in many years." Fan's brow furrowed, but he said nothing. The king looked up at him, and in his eyes now was something new. Not light nor darkness, but depth. "My true name, not the one they sang, not the one they carved into stone. The name given to me in the cradle, whispered by my mother before the wind claimed her. It is the only name I still trust, for in that name I was only a child, not a king, not a symbol, not a shadow." Alan stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. "Then speak it, not to prove anything, not to cast off what has been, but to remember that you are not yet lost." The king hesitated, and then, with a voice that trembled slightly, not with fear but with memory, he whispered the name. It was simple, unremarkable, a name that might have belonged to a shepherd, a poet, a boy chasing fireflies through summer fields. And in that moment something shifted, not loudly, not visibly, but deeply. The coals did not flare, but they stopped dimming. The silence did not vanish, but it softened. Outside, the snow paused in its descent just for a moment, just long enough for the stars to peek through the clouds and remember themselves. The name lingered in the air long after it was spoken, not with the resonance of thunder or proclamation, but like the final note of a lullaby, tender and private, and meant not for the world, but for the soul that carried it. It hung there, weightless, and yet impossibly heavy, like the first snowflake to fall on a battlefield after the war has ended. Beautiful, yes, but drenched in memory. In that breathless space between sound and silence, Thalion felt something stir, not in the room, nor in the fading embers of the fire, but within himself. Something ancient, aching, and profoundly human. The king, no, the man who had once borne that name, stood as if caught between two mirrors, each reflecting a different self. The boy of gentle lineage and golden summers, and the figure he had become, draped in silence, crowned in shadow, and called by none but titles forged in fear. His eyes glistened, though no tears fell. They did not need to. The grief that moved through him was not a thing that weeps, but a thing that waits, quietly, patiently, like the tide inching its way back to shore after 1,000 years of exile. Outside, the hush held the stars newly born again. In the vale above, watched in solemn ceremony, peeing through the silver-gritty tapestry of drifting snow clouds, they cast their pale light upon the rooftops and terraces of the citadel, each beam striking glass and stone and ice as though trying to write poetry across the broken skin of the world. The great towers, once proud and shining, stood now like elder sentinels, bowed under the weight of memory. The wind, no longer howling, whispered instead, a soft, melodic rustling that carried no meaning but much presence, as if the air itself wished to be close to what was unfolding. Balian broke the silence gently, not with words of instruction or plea, but with something that had become exceedingly rare in the passage of these days: truth, unguarded. "When I was young," he said, slowly walking toward the window, My father told me that names are like seeds. They carry not only the sound we answer to, but the memory of who we were when it was first spoken aloud. He believed that to forget one's name was not merely to lose identity, but to lose possibility, the infinite roads that lie open to the soul before the world narrows them. He paused, his gaze falling upon the world below. The snow-laden courtyards, the icy spires casting long shadows under the moonlight, and the faint, distant line of the forest sleeping beneath a quilt of frost. "And yet," he continued, "I think there are names that lie beneath even those names we do not inherit, but create through loss, through pain, through the choices we make when there is no light left to guide us. You speak of listening to the silence, of accepting its truth, but I wonder if silence alone is not enough." The king did not reply at once, but his expression shifted, barely like a mountain, glimpsed beneath retreating mist, more shape than detail, more promise than definition. He turned toward the great window where then now stood, and together they looked out upon the world, two shadows framed in glass and frost and moonlight. "The silence does not offer truth," he said finally, his voice distant, reflective. "It offers space, and within that space, truth either flourishes or withers. I came to believe that if I could strip away everything, the weight of rule, the illusion of legacy, the myths others told in my name, I would find something incorruptible at the core of it all. But I did not find clarity. I found hunger and a mirror that never ceased watching." His eyes drifted down to the ring upon his hand. It no longer burned or glowed, and yet it had never felt more present. The gem, black as night, and yet glinting faintly with its inner fire, reflected nothing. No light, no face, no future. "I thought I could master it by yielding," he went on, voice softening, darkening. "That surrender would bring transcendence. But now I begin to understand that to surrender without vision is not wisdom. It is a rear, and I fear I have wandered too far down a road that leads only to silence so vast it no longer hears itself." Doan placed a hand gently on the sill, his fingertips brushing frost-laced stone. "There is still a voice within you, my lord. I have heard it, even if it comes now through darkness and doubt. And though it may not be the voice of a king, or a prophet, or even the man you once were, it is still yours. You have not vanished. You are simply veiled." The king closed his eyes and turned slightly away. "And what lies beneath the veil, Thalion? What am I when I am no longer the light of my people, nor the shadow that fell upon them?" "A choice," Thalion answered, not hesitating. "You are a choice yet to be made, not by the silence, not by the ring, but by you. And in that, you are more powerful than you know." The words hung in the air, weaving themselves into the fabric of the moment like golden thread through morning cloth. For a long time neither man spoke. They simply stood there, side by side. The silence around them no longer cold, no longer empty, but bearing the shape of something, becoming a hush before the first breath of dawn, when the stars have not yet fled and the sky forgets for a moment whether it is night or day. Beyond the citadel, in the valley below, the snow began to change. It no longer fell in endless sheets of white. Oblivion, instead, it slowed, each flake descending like a thought unspoken, delicate and rare. The wind carried a different note now, still solemn, still reverent, but touched with something else. Not joy, not yet, but maybe remembrance. And beneath the earth, far below, the throne and the towers and the chamber of whispered dreams, the thing that had waited, patient, ancient, unnamed, paused in its slow stirring. For the first time it heard something it did not expect. It heard resistance. The stars held their breath suspended above the kingdom, like a canopy of distant eyes, dim silver, eternal, and the snow, long resigned to its sill ritual, seemed to hesitate in its descent, as though unsure whether to continue blanketing a world poised on the edge of some final, irrevocable turn. The night had deepened into a color that could no longer be named, not black, not blue, but something between shadow and memory, like the hue of a wound long scarred over but never truly healed. And beneath that colorless sky, the towers of the citadel loomed in silhouette, their once proud spires now draped in the heavy veils of frost and silence, as though mourning not only for a fallen season, but for an entire age. Within the library, the last of the firelight died with a faint sigh, leaving behind only the faintest trace of heat in the hearthstone, and the smell, faint, almost imperceptible, of ash mingled with ancient vellum. Yet neither Thalion nor the king moved to stir the fire back to life. They remained by the window, unmoving, speaking only in the language of silence and shared breath. Two figures outlined against the frost-laced panes, their reflections barely visible in the faint glow cast by the starlit snow below. At length the king stirred, not with haste nor hesitation, but with a slowness born of profound contemplation, as though each movement was the conclusion of a long and difficult thought. He turned from the window, drawing in a breath that trembled just slightly at the edges, and walked toward the center of the room where the great map of the realm lay upon the long oaken table, its surface traced with the paths of rivers and mountain ranges, forests long since darkened, and cities whose names were now whispered only in song, sung by wind through broken stone. His fingers hovered above the map, not touching it, as though afraid that contact would break the delicate spell that now filled the chamber. He did not look at Thalion when he spoke, but his voice carried clearly, as though drawn not from his throat, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere beneath the weight of years and regret. "There was a time," he said slowly, "when I believed history to be a river flowing inexorably, guided by the shape of the land and the weight of the heavens. I believed my role was to stand within it, to channel its current, to shape the course of fate with the tools of will and wisdom. But now I see I was wrong. History is not a river. It is a mirror, shattered by every choice we make, each fragment reflecting a different truth, a different self. And the more we try to gather those shits to create a coherent whole, the more we bleed." Thalion stepped forward, his eyes drawn not to the map, but to the king himself. The set of his shoulders, the quiet tremor in his hands, the almost imperceptible quaver in his voice, that revealed more than any confession could. "You are not wrong to seek meaning," he said, his words gentle but firm, as though trying to mend something with voice alone. "But perhaps meaning is not something we impose upon the world. Perhaps it is something we discover in how we endure it, not in the victories we claim or the power we wield, but in the quiet moments we choose to stay when it would be easier to leave." The king's hand dropped, resting lightly on the table's edge, and his gaze lifted to meet Thalion. In that gaze there was weariness. Yes, immeasurable, oceanic. But there was also a flicker of something else. Not hope, not yet, but awareness. The slow return of a self long buried beneath the weight of myth and memory. "I thought," the king said, "that I had become the vessel for something greater, something older than stars and darker than the spaces between them. I thought that by surrendering, I could become a new kind of order, a silence that would endure when all songs had faded. But now I wonder if I have simply fled from the wound of being human." Delan approached the table and placed a hand over the map, not to command it, not to mark it, but to feel it, to remember that it represented more than land or conquest. It represented lives, laughter, loss. "There is no shame in fleeing," he said. "We all flee from grief, from failure, from the unbearable weight of choices that unravel what we thought we were. But the question is not whether we flee, it is whether we ever return, and if we do, what we bring back with us from the dark." The king closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, something had shifted. His hand moved slowly, deliberately to the ring upon his finger. He looked at it not as a master regards his servant, nor as a king regards his crown, but as a man regards a mirror, seeing not what he is, but what he might yet be. "I do not know," he whispered, "if I can take it off." Thalion nodded, his voice low but resolute. "Then let me stand beside you, not as one who demands your release, but as one who reminds you that you are not alone in the choosing." And then, in the deepest hush of that long night, beneath stars that had not shone for many days, the king slowly, carefully began to slide the ring from his hand. The world did not tremble, the snow did not cease, but somewhere deep beneath the citadel, in the chamber where silence once sang and shadow once listened, a sound was heard. It was not the cry of power relinquished. It was the sigh of chains undone. And above, in the highest tower, the frost began to melt upon the window panes, one drop up at a time.